My name is Jana, and we here at Interactive Intelligence are very honored to have Dr. Stephen Grossberg to talk with us today. Dr. Grossberg is widely regarded as an important founding member of the fields of computational neuroscience, theoretical psychology, and neuromorphic technology. His work has focused on developing theories and supporting equations that can predict and understand the mechanisms behind learning, memory, and behaviors. He has published over 500 times and written around 20 books. Dr. Grossberg also founded the Department of Cognitive Sciences and Neurosystems, and he currently serves as the Ring Professor. He has worked at Boston University for more than 47 years, and he has been busy as a professor emeritus, which means that he retired with honors of mathematics and statistics, psychological and brain sciences, and biomedical engineering. If you want to learn more about the topics we're going to discuss today, please check out his recently published book called Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, How the Brain Makes a Mind. To further introduce his background, after becoming the first joint undergraduate major in mathematics and psychology at Dartmouth University and mathematics as a Ph.D. student at Stanford and Rockefeller, he became an assistant professor and taught applied mathematics at MIT while he continued to discover and develop a stream of conceptual and mathematical results about the many aspects of neural networks. Unlike Dr. Grossberg, most did not believe in this mysterious domain of computational neuroscience in the 1970s. Dr. Grossberg eventually moved to Boston University in 1975, and there, the president and provost believed in his vision and awarded him an endowed chair in cognitive and neurosystems. There, he established the Department of Cognitive and Neurosystems, which he and many gifted colleagues developed into the world's leading graduate department that theoretically explains how brains make minds, carries out experiments to test these explanations and predictions, and applies these insights to applications in engineering, technology, and AI. He is the foundational architect of this field. In particular, his models help to explain essentially all the fundamental brain processes that make us human and provide a blueprint for an AI with human-level intelligence. It is worth mentioning Dr. Grossberg's biggest collaborator and mathematician wife, Gail Carpenter. Together, they developed the wide-ranging adaptive resonance theory and founded Boston University's Department of Cognitive and Neurosystems. The 600-page book you see right here, which I have introduced in the beginning, is actually dedicated to his wife, Gail Carpenter. One of Dr. Grossberg's goals is to reach the broader audience, so not only did he write his book in a self-contained and non-technical manner, he also paid Oxford University Press his own money to make his 600-page book cheaper for the general public to access. He will talk in more detail about his book and work in today's discussion. And believe it or not, this very long intro is only scratching the surface of his work. Now it is time to finally meet Dr. Grossberg and start a Q&A session. Could you just start by giving us a brief overview of the work that you have done over the years, and how would you explain your work to someone that does not have any prior knowledge?
Sure. Are you going to open the screen so I could see you and people can see me, Jana?
So stop share.
Yeah, great. So first I should say, given that the audience does consist of students, that my work began in 1957 when I took introductory psychology as a 17-year-old college freshman at Dartmouth College, so you're never too young to start. At that time, I was fascinated by classical psychological data about how humans learn lists of things. In particular, there was a famous serial verbal learning experimental literature, and it was paradoxes in those data that forced me, in a way that I'll clarify, to introduce the paradigm of using systems and nonlinear differential equations to explain how our brains make our minds, as well as the basic equations for starting to do that. And they include equations for cell activation, neuronal activation, or short-term memory, activity-dependent habituation or medium-term memory, and learning and memory or long-term memory that still form the foundation of all biological models of how brains make minds to the present. And I rapidly started with more and more collaborators as the years went on to use the models to explain an increasingly broad range of psychological phenomena. So my point here is that since this early beginning 65 years ago, all my work is try to explain how brain mechanisms, starting just with the basic equations, control psychological functions. And that's why I like to emphasize that brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success. It doesn't matter if you have gorgeous neurons, if they can't control successful behavior, then Darwinian selection will wipe you out. And that's why my new book is called Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind. And why do we need models? Well, interactions within and across several brain regions are often needed to generate these psychological functions. And these behaviors are thus emergent properties of the brain interactions. You know, the cells themselves are simple. The emergent properties can have language, can have emotion, can have cognition. So purely experimental approaches can't really understand emergent properties. That's where models are essential. And in order to derive these models, I developed the modeling method and cycle. So because brain evolution needs to achieve behavioral success, the modeling method always started with scores or even hundreds of psychological experiments, because that's the level on which behavioral success is defined. Now, when we study data in a book, it's just, you know, static curves of this variable against that. And the art of modeling is to think about the data long enough, develop a deep enough intuition into it, that you can imagine it as being created by an individual mind acting autonomously in real time to adapt to its environment. That's the art of modeling. It's a speculative leap, no algorithm for it. Ask any scientist who's done serious theory and ask them to explain the speculative leap. They won't be able to tell you. Niels Bohr, Albert Einstein, none of them could tell you. So by thinking in real time about the data, that's the hardest thing, how the data emerges from an individual mind interacting with the world. The method, if you think hard enough about hundreds of experiments, leads you to discover underlying design principles. And then you can convert the design principles into the minimal mathematical models that embody them, and use the models to explain a lot more psychological data than went into their derivation. But the big surprise to me when I was a kid was that the models looked like neural networks, and we were explaining data about mind, and so these were biological neural networks. I didn't even know about neurons when I derived them. My pre-medical student friends told me about neurons and axons and transmitters and synapses. Well, clearly you can't derive a brain in one step. And so after doing one stage of the derivation, I could see its explanatory limits. Said in a more colorful way, I can see the boundary between what I knew and what I didn't know. And understanding the shape of that boundary always suggested a new design principle. And then I could go through the cycle again and get an expanded, more predictive, more explanatory, deeper model that often included the earlier model although maybe in a refined way. For example, ultimately, the neural networks forced me into predicting why the circuits in the neocortex are all laminar, layered circuits, and how they work. So that was part of this unlumping process. And so to sum this up, I developed a modeling cycle that leads to increasingly realistic models of ever greater explanatory power. And since I started many years ago, I've gone through cycles many, many times. And if you look at my book, A Picture's 1,000 Words, in chapter 2, figure 237, gives you a picture of the modeling cycle. So the crucial thing is I always try to understand the meaning of the data. And to do that, you have to develop experimental intuition. And so my recommendation to young people who want to understand the mind or brain or both, you got to fall in love with data you desperately want to understand. You know, if you're not dying to know what they mean, you're not going to put in the work needed to figure it out. Now, in particular, I fell in love with a problem for which there were a lot of data in 1957, going back to the 30s through the 50s, how we learn and remember lists of events or items. And that's because the passage of time greatly influenced those data. And let me just sketch for you why that led me to introduce neural networks. So starting with psychological data about how, for example, you learn the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, I was led to equations for short-term, medium-term, and long-term memory. That's a huge leap, and it seemed very natural, even to a 17-year-old. And so serial verbal learning, you'll practice a list of items or events over and over and over again at a certain rate. You present each item at a certain rate, then you rest, you present it again at that rate, and you rest. You keep going until you reach a criterion where you can predict the next item correctly before you see it. So I say A, you predict B, I say B, you predict C, and so forth. So it's just an example of practice makes perfect. And the reason I was excited by these data is a classical serial position curve for cumulative errors. After you've gone through a number of learning trials, how many errors occur at each list position, A to B or Y to Z or M to N? And it was such a paradoxical thing. People were writing that anyone who can explain it should get a Nobel Prize in psychology, which of course doesn't exist. Anyway, why was it a paradox? It's because there were more errors in the middle of the list than at the beginning or the end. So the beginning and the end are easier to learn than the middle, or, you know, I like saying in a cute sort of way, it's sort of like a relationship. You remember how it started, how it ended, but the middle is a muddle. So why is it paradoxical? You might have assumed that as you get deeper and deeper in the list, like if this were a computer, you would accumulate more and more errors because there's more response interference due to the stuff that you've already been presented. But it doesn't get harder and harder. It gets harder and then it gets easier. There's an inverted U in the errors. So moreover, if you increase the amount of rest, then the entire distribution of errors through the whole list changes. Like, let's say you present the items every 2 seconds, you rest for 6 seconds, versus you present them every 4 seconds, which is slower, and you rest for 2 minutes and 6 seconds. In the latter, the whole error curve from the faster rate crashes. And the longer you rest, the bigger the crash is. So that showed that the non-occurrence of a future item, i.e. a longer rest before you repeat the list, can influence the learning of all past lists. So that implies in some sense, events can influence each other backwards in time because a future non-occurrence can influence the whole distribution of past events. And as a 17-year-old, I found that really exciting. A simpler example of that is called backward learning. Let's say I practice A, B. Well, if you test this, that'll also increase your probability of, if you're given B, you'll say A. So AB helps you to learn BA. That's backward in time. But on the other hand, we can still learn A, B, C, which means the association from B to C must have been stronger than that from B to A. So even though there are backward effects, the future is stronger than the past. Well, what does that mean? Because of all these interactions between everything recurrently, you need a network with nodes representing A, B, C, or whatever, and associations from A to B, and from B to A, and from A to C, and from C to A. And that's what forced me into neural networks. And because the rates at which all these things happened influenced the learning, I needed a time scale finer than 2 seconds or 4 seconds or 1 second or whatever. And in science, the classical way of representing a time scale that's finer than any macroscopic event time scale is differential equations. So I needed nonlinear differential equations because of the recurrent interactions between the short-term memory activations and how they activated long-term memory at the synapses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So about my book, I think you want to ask me another question.
So basically, our next question was, how do you get to the presentation? Sorry.
Well,
Could you say new book?
If it's hard for you to keep pulling it up, I wrote all your questions down.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I'm trying to maybe log into another Zoom account and maybe pull it up there. That could be an option, but you could go on and answer this question for now.
Okay, so the question, could you say a little more about the book and its contents?
Yes.
So as I remarked, the book is called Conscious Mind, Resonant Brain, How Each Brain Makes a Mind. And I want to emphasize it was written for the general public. That doesn't mean it isn't challenging. We're talking about our minds, which are one of the most complicated systems we can understand in science. But to help the people who want to read it, it's self-contained. I try to keep it as non-technical as possible. I wrote it in a conversational style, and wherever I could, I wrote it as a series of stories. And so it really tries to give an overview of the main processes whereby each brain makes a mind. Said in another way, it helps to scientifically explain the human condition, which is all about that. And it provides principled and unifying explanations of the data really in hundreds of psychological and neurobiological experiments. And it makes theoretical predictions, many of which have been confirmed by subsequent data. So if you haven't looked at the book, it's spread over a preface and 17 chapters. As I was saying to Chaitan before, if you don't have time or interest to read the whole thing, read the preface. I wrote the chapters to be readable independently of each other, so jump then into a chapter or chapters whose topics interest you the most. But the book begins with perception, both visual and auditory, and then it goes on to discuss cognition, emotion, and action. And it does it in both healthy individuals and people who suffer from clinical disorders, including Alzheimer's disease, autism, amnesia, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and so on. And you might say, well, why did you get into studying mental disorders? And here I want to make a general point. If you work really hard to understand the underlying principles that govern a scientific process, it will give you more than you ever expected to explain. So after explaining large amounts of data about normal or typical behaviors, I was able to begin understanding if they become imbalanced or damaged in prescribed ways, that leads to mechanistic explanations of the behavioral symptoms of quite a few mental disorders. So I call it the gift that keeps on giving. If you work really hard, you'll get the gift that keeps on giving. Just like I never try to understand consciousness, I only try to understand learning. But you notice that consciousness is in the title of my book. Anyway, chapter 17, if you want to jump to chapters, it really gets more speculative and discusses biological bases of creativity, morality, religion, causality. You know, how do we learn what causes what? And also clarifies how we can adhere to superstitious or self-defeating or even false beliefs in certain social environments despite disconfirming evidence, just like people who believe conspiracy theories today in the United States. And I should emphasize that what the book tries to clarify is how perception, cognition, emotion, action cycles with the environment support this kind of intelligence. So I think that's enough on question 2.
Okay, wait, so I just had a follow-up question on that before I ask the next one. You mentioned, like, in general, your book helps to explain the human condition, which I guess makes sense in that, you know, any way that we can sort of explain why the mind works and how the mind works would help explain the human condition. But I just feel like that was a broad statement. Do you want to elaborate a little, or?
Well, only in the sense that the book tries to clarify the foundations of the main processes whereby we know the world. It doesn't do everything. And one of your questions later is what I haven't done that I would like to do or someone should do. And that'll clarify. I don't think it's everything, but it gives a foundation. That's why I said, when you talk about the human condition, that includes things like biological bases of creativity, morality, religion, and so on. These are important parts of the human condition. So it's in that sense, it gives a foundation. It's not, nothing in the book is sufficient. I hope it's all necessary. But remember that science is never finished. Even theoretical physics, even Newton didn't finish it. Even Einstein didn't finish it. Heisenberg didn't finish it. It's always a process, okay? But the foundation, if the foundation is secure, a revolution in physics might refine the foundation, or it might lead a new direction, like in quantum theory, but the foundation will endure, just like Newton's equations are assimilated into Einstein's general relativity theory.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So one of the things that we talk about a lot is back propagation. So, you know, one of the things that machine learning talks about a lot in general is does this exist in the brain? And is it biologically plausible? So what do you think about that?
Oh, well, and before we move on, I'm just gonna say all the questions, we're gonna ask the questions at the very end. So Chris, I'm sorry, if you have any questions right now, you can hold on.
Yeah, I welcome that. So I'm gonna give a short piece of an answer now, and then the next question you ask me will enable me to lay the foundation to give a deeper answer. So the short answer is that backpropagation and deep learning that uses backpropagation as its learning engine is just a feed-forward adaptive filter. You know, you go from here to here with adaptive weights. And it learns using a mechanism, what's called non-local weight transport. And what that means is you artificially move the adaptive weights that you learn from the location in the network where you learn them to where you need them to filter bottom-up inputs. That non-local weight transport is not a physical operation, let alone a brain operation. So non-local transport has no analog in the brain, where all interactions, as in, you know, all macroscopic physical theories, are local. Now, the next question you asked me will let me answer that in a more specific and deeper way. So you should go on to that.
Will do. Okay, then in what ways does deep learning and deep learning differ from adaptive resonance theory?
Okay, so I have to tell you a little about what is adaptive resonance theory and then how they differ. So essentially, all the deepest insights about how a brain works that I've ever discovered come from an analysis of how brains self-organize, both through childhood development and adult learning. You know, you start with an individual cell, goes through mitosis, da-da-da-da-da-da. Development and learning are going on at an incredible rate. And like we're learning now in real time, you won't remember everything we discussed, but you'll remember a shocking amount of it. Or going to an exciting movie, you'll remember a shocking amount of scenes that flash by at a very fast frame rate. So I would claim that adaptive resonance theory, or for short, ART, is the most advanced cognitive and neural theory of how our brains learn to attend, recognize, and predict objects and events in a changing world. And I say that because of its explanatory and predictive success. So unlike deep learning, ART is not just a feed-forward adaptive filter. It's a principled theory. It's not a filter, it's not an algorithm, it's a theory of key processes of biological intelligence embodied by a self-organizing, explainable, and I have to say what that means, production system. And I'll have to explain what that means if you ask me. And it carries out hypothesis testing, fast self-stabilizing learning, classification and prediction in a rapidly changing or non-stationary world. Deep learning dies in a non-stationary world. Unlike R, deep learning is untrustworthy because it's not explainable. And I'll say what that means in a minute. And it's unreliable because it experiences catastrophic forgetting. I'll explain what that is in a minute. And in an oft-cited paper I wrote in 1988, but it's reviewed in my book, I showed that backpropagation has 17 problems, not just those two that adaptive resonance theory doesn't. So what does not explainable mean? Well, as I will be explaining to you in a moment, because ART has short-term memory traces, activations, ART can focus attention on a set of critical features that are going to control predictive success. I call it a critical feature pattern. I'll say more about it in a moment. And anyone who is looking at an ARC network by looking at the critical features knows the information that it's using to make its prediction, so you can explain how it's making its prediction. But you can't do that with deep learning. So if you used it in a medical or financial application and someone died or you went broke and it was challenged deep learning, you'd be sued for everything you're worth because you don't know why it works or whether it works. It's not explainable. And catastrophic forgetting means when you're doing this very slow supervised learning and deep learning, which is another problem, it's one of the 17 problems, or can learn in one trial, like I learned your faces in one trial today, within a second. At any point in that slow learning, an unpredictable part of the memory can crash and burn. It's forgotten catastrophically, all because it's a feed-forward adaptive filter. So it's untrustworthy because it's not explainable. It's unreliable because it experiences catastrophic forgetting. Now, art, the reason I say it's the most advanced theory is not only have all of the foundational hypotheses of art been confirmed by subsequent experiments, but it's also provided principled and unifying explanations of hundreds of additional experiments since I introduced it in 1978. I should say art was not created with no changes. It's been evolving incrementally. Remember I said that there were laminar circuit embodiments in the neocortex now of art. That's called Lamin Art. That wasn't part of the original theory, but it still embodies the original hypotheses, but in a refined form. It's an unlumping process. Now, why should you believe it? Explanatory success is one criterion, but there's a much more profound reason that in a way you have to believe it. And in 1980, I was able to derive art from a thought experiment about how any learning system can autonomously correct predictive errors in a changing world. You may know the thought experiments of Einstein, where he derived special relativity and general relativity. I don't know if you study any physics. But when you can use a thought experiment to derive a theory, you've hit gold. And that's because the hypotheses of my thought experiment and Einstein's are facts that are familiar to everyone because they represent ubiquitous environmental pressures on the evolution of our brains. So it's not like you have to go running into a psychology or neuroscience book to follow the thought experiment. The hypotheses are trivial. What gives the thought experiment the power is if you realize that a few ubiquitous constraints are operating together on the evolution of your brain, art will happen. So I recommend either in the book or in my psych review paper, you read the thought experiment. And critically, nowhere in the thought experiment are the words mind or brain mentioned. So in this sense, art design principles and mechanisms are a universal solution to this learning problem. I don't take it personally. If you can find a problem in the thought experiment, I have to take it back. If you can't, you're stuck. And I call the learning problem the stability plasticity dilemma because it asks how any system can learn quickly without experiencing catastrophic forgetting. Plasticity is the learning, stability is no catastrophic forgetting, please. And so as we can talk further if we have time, it's therefore, I think, remarkable that these art results about learning led me in many, many steps later, decades later, to try to explain how and why, from an evolutionary perspective, we have consciousness, how we consciously see, hear, feel, and know things about the world, and why we use conscious states to plan and act to realize valued goals. So I didn't know this in 1978. I didn't know this till 2009. That's a long time. So the conscious states all arise from resonances, which occur when excitatory feedback signals between two or more brain signals approximately match their signal patterns well enough to cause the active cells to synchronize, boom, 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 boom. And because of the excitatory feedback sustained, they're firing long enough to trigger a conscious state and learning in the adaptive weights that are sending the signals in bottom-up and top-down adaptive filters. And it's because of that I call the theory adaptive resonance theory, because resonance provides the dynamic state that drives learning or adaptation. And it's the top-down expectations in art that solve the stability plasticity dilemma, i.e. enable you to get fast learning without catastrophic forgetting. And it isn't a feed-forward adaptive filter. It's a resonating bottom-up, top-down. The top-down expectations by top-down matching and then driving memory searching, hypothesis testing is what solves the catastrophic forgetting problem. So if you want to, talk highfalutin, the proposed solution here, the mind-body problem, arises from a computational analysis of how humans and other higher animals autonomously learn in a changing world without catastrophic forgetting. And I want to emphasize, I also used another thought experiment to derive a model of cognitive emotional processes, or how thinking and feeling interact to realize valued goals. And that also uses hypotheses you're all familiar with. You just have to think about them in the right way and you're forced into it. And I use this model to explain lots of facts about how thinking and feeling interact. I call it the COG-M model, which is short for cognitive emotional motor, because there's a cognitive emotional interaction leading to actions in the world that have predictive consequences in reward and punishment. And so because of thought experiments to derive both cognitive models like art as well as cognitive emotional models like COG-M never mention the words mind or brain, they provide a blueprint for autonomous, adaptive, intelligent applications in engineering, technology, and AI. They're not about mind and brain per se. They're about how you adapt autonomously in real time to different kind of environmental constraints. So really, I think if I had to say, well, what did Steve Grossberg do in 3 words or less? I'd say I introduced the revolutionary paradigm of autonomous adaptive intelligence. And that is going to be more and more what our engineering and technology and AI will be doing in the future. Increasingly autonomous, intelligent, adaptive devices. small beginnings now in self-driving planes and trains and cars, but wait 50 years. I won't be around, but hopefully you will be. So to make this work, the top-down expectations in adaptive resonance theory are defined by a circuit that avoids catastrophic forgetting by being designed in a very specific way. They obey what I call the art matching rule, and it's realized by a particular anatomical circuit that's now been confirmed anatomically in multiple species, including bats. So it's realized by a top-down, let me say the words, modulatory on-center, off-surround network. The on-center cells are excited by their top-down inputs, but they're only primed. They're sensitized. They get just a little boost because it's modulating. It's getting you ready. It's getting you ready to expect something that may or may not occur. The off-surround is a driving off-surround. It's inhibiting cells around the modulatory on-center. So the modulatory on-center is priming you, and these primed cells are selectively coding the features to which the network will start to pay attention. And I call that feature pattern the critical feature pattern, because the critical feature pattern, when you go into resonance, are going to be the patterns that are going to go in the adaptive weights in your bottom-up filters and in your top-down expectations. The critical features are going to be the ones that are going to drive predictions and action, and that's why they're explainable, because you can actually record them if you have the right microelectrode array. So the art matching rule, in summary, enables these top-down expectations to select, pay attention to, and learn the critical feature patterns that control predictive success. And to do that, you need short-term memory activation, cell activations, which deep learning doesn't have. So in summary, the art matching rule solves the stability plasticity dilemma because outlier features that fall in the off surround are inhibited. Only predictive critical features are attended and learned. So the outlier features cannot cause catastrophic forgetting.
That leads to our next question.
Yeah, I mean, so do we have top-down expectations like when we're born, or how does that work if we don't
Well,
start?
skipping. Oh no, you're not skipping. That's fine. Yeah, great. So I'd like to recast the question a little bit. See why I want to keep the order, because I built the whole thing up so it's self-contained, even though it's all too brief. Let's translate into the question of how does learning get started, you know? Especially if there are no learned top-down expectations to match learned patterns, because you haven't learned anything yet. So said another way, how does a top-down expectation match a pattern before anything is learned, like when you're a kid? And my prediction is, and it's consistent with all our models, it is done by choosing the initial top-down adaptive weights. So you have cells, they're active, they send signals down axons, they're gated by long-term memory trace or adaptive weights. These adaptive weights are all chosen to be uniformly distributed from each category cell to all of its target feature pattern cells. In other words, because the top-down weights are uniform across the network, they can match any input pattern before learning begins. And so what learning does is it prunes these big top-down weights so they gradually match the critical feature patterns that are incrementally discovered in bottom-up feature patterns on multiple learning trials. So the top-down weights are gradually converging on a stable set of critical features, as are the bottom-up weights through the adaptive filter. Does that help? So
Yeah,
you can't match any particular thing. So you have top-down uniform weights, so you can match anything. And that's how you can get started. Because if you mismatched on the first trial, you can never go into resonance. You get a reset and everything would crash.
yeah, okay, that makes sense. But okay, one other question. I can see how art can explain clustering and grouping like similar things together. But for problems like something like regression, does it have a way to do that?
Did you say regression?
Yeah, like predicting a particular number, for example.
In what context? You have to be more specific. It's much too broad.
Right. So I mean,
Well,
machine
Art
learning.
can learn to predict anything if you have Arcmap. In other words, it's one thing to talk about unsupervised art, which is just category learning, but to do prediction, let's say, for example, you're trying to learn by looking at multiple fonts of letters that you see visually to learn a whole series of categories that'll respond selectively to different letter fonts. And before that learning occurs, there are pre-processing stages that will let you learn those letter shapes, no matter what size they are, no matter what position they are, no matter what orientation they are. So you learn invariant categories for recognizing the letters. But at the same time, you have another modality where you're learning to understand, let's say we did that for the letter A in vision. And then in audition, you learn how to say A and to understand A. So you have an auditory thing going on. And then you'll have an associative map from vision to audition, so that if you see any letter A in any font, you can come out and say verbally, oh, that's the letter A. It could be that map, it could be it's the number 10, doesn't matter. So if you look at fuzzy Arcmap, distributed Arcmap, these can operate both in supervised or unsupervised mode. You can learn an arbitrary number of trials, either unsupervised, supervised, or some hybrid. So look up fuzzy Arcmap, look up distributed Arcmap. These are no longer just category learning things, either prediction systems, okay?
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so then our next question has to do with some of the things we talked about in our journal club previously, where there's 150,000 cortical columns about in the neocortex. So we're curious because we've heard some other theories, like does art have an explanation for what each one does as a module, or why it's structured that way?
The answer is yes. Although I didn't have it in 78, this took decades to do. So what I call my Lamin Art Model provides a detailed anatomical, neurophysiological, and functional explanation of why lamina neocortex exists and how identified cells in different cortical columns operate. And so I call the fact that all neocortex has lamina circuits typically 6 main layers in perceptual and cognitive circuits. I call it the paradigm of laminar computing. And laminar computing begins to explain how all higher forms of biological intelligence are generated by variations of a single canonical laminar cortical circuit. And in particular, with multiple colleagues, I've developed laminar models of vision, speech perception, and cognition that are all using variations of the same canonical laminar cortical circuit. So that's an existence proof. It's not the end of the story. There's a century of additional work by young people like you. But that existence proof shows how things as different from vision, speech, and cognition can all be explained. Tons of data, seemingly very different data, can all emerge from from specializations of the same canonical circuit. And now, if you want to talk about laminar computing on a very high level and say, well, what does it do? Not the specific level of explaining a lot of data. First, it realizes 3 high-level computational goals. The first is the developmental and learning process whereby cortex shapes its circuits to match environmental constraints and dynamically maintain them. That is to solve the stability plasticity dilemma. So as I said, art morphed into Lamin art to explain the stability plasticity dilemma. It also carries out the binding process whereby cortex groups distributed data into coherent object representation. And you have very different appearances of grouping in visual perception, than in speech perception, than in cognitive working memory, but they all use, if I'm correct, and the data support me so far, variations of the same canonical circuit. And finally, the attentional process, whereby cortex selectively processes important events. So first, self-stabilizing learning, then distributed binding problem, and then attention. And what I've shown is, if you understand how to solve the stability plasticity dilemma in a laminate setting, that is to say, the first property, you get the grouping and attention for free. They fall out of the wash. It's really one problem. It's the learning problem. And I also prepared some notes because, laminar computing is one paradigm I introduced. I also introduced what I call complementary computing. And maybe, if you'll bear with me, I'll say a little about that because it's through an understanding of complementary computing that I was led to be able to explain some data about consciousness. Should I do that or should I skip it? Whatever.
I think we're a little bit short on time for now.
So
We're a little bit short on time right now.
we're what right now?
We're a bit short on time right now.
We're on time?
We're
So
short
should I-
on time.
You
We're
said
not-
we're short on time, if
Okay,
that's all right.
I'll skip it. It's fine with me. If it comes up in later sessions, if there's time, okay. So you
Okay.
want to do the next question then?
Sure. So do you have anything that art has not explained to your satisfaction about the brain?
Well, the first thing I should say is art is just a small part of my work. So, I mean, I can say a little more in a few minutes about a broader perspective of my work as reflected in my book. But if you said what I haven't explained to my satisfaction about how the brain works, which is how the question was phrased, let me make the following remarks. First, as I already commented, no scientific theory is ever complete. Even superstring theory is not complete. So I'd like to have a better understanding of language in all its complexity. I have created a foundation for doing it in my work that clarifies basic mechanisms of audition, speech learning, and perception and cognition. But to really understand language in all its complexity, let alone poetry, it'll take a lot of people working for a long time. But I have also been recently working on how language meanings are learned in infants and children. And so language isn't just about explaining data independent of meaning, okay? Secondly, I'd like to understand music better and social cognition better. I just published a first article about music in Frontiers in Systems Neuroscience. It just sort of touches the surface, but it's called Toward Understanding the Brain Dynamics of Music, Learning and Conscious Performance of Lyrics and Melodies with Variable Rhythms and Beats. And what's interesting about it, in part, is that I was able to use this stuff I summarize in my book to make that paper. And 12 years ago, in 2010, with my postdoc, Tony Vladisich, I published the first article in the journal Neural Networks about social cognition, including an explanation of how a student can share joint attention with a teacher while learning a new skill from her. In other words, if you watch someone doing something, you can try to imitate it, even though you're seeing it from a different perspective. That requires what's called joint attention. And it's a problem in autism. A lot of autistic individuals can't do joint attention. And that paper is called How Do Children Learn to Follow Gaze, Share Joint Attention, Imitate Their Teachers, and Use Tools during social interaction. I've done a lot of work on how and why we can use tools. And both of these contributions just beginning. So there are many things I'd like to understand better. Language, music, social cognition are just a drop in the bucket. But in each case, the foundation of my book helped me. So you want to go to the next question?
Yes. Hey, I'm Andre.
What's your name?
Andre?
Andre?
Yes.
Hi, Andre. Did Jenna have to go?
I'm just asking the next two questions. That's fine. The next question is, can we reach general artificial intelligence by simulating the brain or by simulating the evolution of the brain, or both?
Okay. So please keep in mind that the thought experiments from which my cognitive and cognitive emotional models were derived don't mention mind or brain. They're consequences of several familiar types of environmental constraints conjointly shaping the evolution of our brains. So the models are universal solutions of how any system can autonomously correct predictive errors in a changing world. So the key point is autonomy. If you want AI to emulate human intelligence, which we often do, if only to be able to interact with human operators, then the results show the answer is yes, because it's universal.
And then next question, generally, what do you think is the next large milestone task or milestone task for AI development to accomplish?
So whenever I'm asked a question like this, I say, I couldn't predict the present, so I never try to predict the future. That's just for me hubris. But that being said, my work tries to explain how biological intelligence works. But AI doesn't have to restrict itself in that way. You know, if AI has a completely different set of goals and doesn't care if it's like biology, that's fine. Part of the problem is, if you want to be intelligent, how are you going to define intelligence if not in terms of correcting predictive errors? And then you have a universal solution. So anyway, I can't say more than that, but I hope that helps. You have to really think about the universality of these solutions. And for that, you have to read the thought experiments. And if you can't get out of them, you're stuck. And I haven't ever seen a way out of them. So I'm stuck. But the good thing about being stuck is I've been a theorist for 65 years. And because I've gotten to this level of foundational principle that the thought experiments, among other methods, helped me to find, I never hit a brick wall. I have worked through multiple fads, which are the hottest things since, I don't know, chocolate cake or Marilyn Monroe, whatever your preference is, for 2 or 3 years, and then they hit a brick wall and they're gone and forgotten. Really, 20 of them, more, over the decades. But I never hit a brick wall. So another way of saying that is, if you want to have a productive research life, which you don't necessarily, there are lots of other ways to enjoy a life. Worry about the foundation so you don't hit a brick wall. If that requires that you have to study Grossberg because he worked for 65 years already, and you can't just try to rediscover the wheel because someone will get up to you and say, but Grossberg did that already, you just wasted your time. But if you can use people like me as a launching pad, then you can go on without hitting a brick wall.
So then I guess how, to expand on that question, how do you see your work being used in the future?
What?
How, to expand on that, how would you see your work being used in the future?
Now that's just off the cuff, that's not here, right?
No, yeah, that's just curious about
But I
some.
already answered that question. I can't predict the present.
Okay.
So what I feel is the following. Let's talk scientific politics. You know, we pride ourselves on living in a world where there's almost instantaneous communication. But because of that, the signal to noise ratio is exceedingly low. There's a lot of noise out there. Moreover, the marketers, shameless marketers, are exceptionally loud. So for example, both backprop and deep learning have sold their wares in a way that I consider intellectually dishonest. Does Jeff Hinton ever tell you my work is unexplainable and unreliable? You know, it's untrustworthy and unreliable? No. He says, this is the way the brain works. You know, it's just unfortunate. So between the ignorant and or dishonest marketing and just all the other things that can attract your attention, work like mine, even though it's been building incrementally with thousands of people have applied it, hundreds have developed it, gets a little lost in it because there isn't a buzzword. You have to actually study for a while to learn something, and then you can get a huge reward. I mean, I don't know if you read the reviews of my book. Well, the pre-publication reviews are by 22 of the most famous people in psychology, neuroscience, and technology. And they sort of wrote things that made me blush. But the 100 post-publication reviews, 2 of them said, I'm the Einstein of the mind. I didn't write that, they did. Now, let's say they're right. You might say, well, if he's Einstein and the mind is the next, the biggest revolution in science, which many people feel, then why don't we all know about him? And that has to do, I think, not only because we live in a world with a very low signal to noise ratio, but also the nature of the mind and the nature of Einstein's work. Einstein makes a famous prediction about the perihelion of Mercury. Everyone, since you're a child, looks up at the heavens. The heavens obsessed all historic civilizations. You'd look at it to know your omen, you'd look at it to navigate. Different moons predict, will it be romantic tonight? Everyone sees the heavens. So when the perihelion of Mercury was predicted, we all knew what that meant. But the whole point about mind is the property of cognitive impenetrability. For many, many years, people didn't even know that the mind was in the brain. Some people thought it was in the pancreas. It's been some people thought it was in the heart. There's been a lot of discussion because it's cognitive impenetrability. And now you might say, well, why do we have cognitive impenetrability? Well, thank God that we do. Because since we don't have to worry about cells and axons and synapses and transmitters and resonances, all we have to worry about are thoughts and feelings and acts, and we can live in a macroscopic world like our interaction now. So those are some of the reasons.
Sure. Yeah. That
You
makes
want
sense.
to back to these questions here, or I think in a way I've anticipated a number of them.
Yeah, I think we got the 10th one because I think we've talked about catastrophic forgetting. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna skip that. Do you mind if we take some questions from the audience?
No, but let me just make a remark about one of the questions you didn't ask, because I think it might anticipate some concern.
Sure.
There was a question, do you think that some form of art is necessary and sufficient for intelligent behavior? And I want to clarify that although art and cogm are universal, they're a very small part of our brains. The classifiers, even learning invariant object categories, occur in just a couple of parts of our brain, in infratemporal cortex, the posterior and anterior infratemporal cortex. And if you look in my book, I talk about the predictive art or part model, which shows how this classification part is embedded in a much larger brain architecture for achieving biological intelligence. Just for starters, working memory circuits in prefrontal cortex, which I didn't discuss at all, they temporarily store sequences of recently occurring events. like storing a sentence or something. And they use these sequences to learn and choose plans to achieve currently valued goals. There were linguistic working memories for speech and language. There were spatial working memories for navigation. There were motor working memories for skilled movements like dancing and tool use. So what we talked about with the classifiers today, and even the Arcmap supervised mapping system, a very small part of what makes biological intelligence possible. So the predictive art model, you can look at it up in the back, but if you don't have the book, although I think it's a good place for one-stop shopping, I published an article in 2018 about it. It has a funny name titled Desirability, Availability, Credit Assignment, Category Learning and Attention, Cognitive, Emotional, and Working Memory Dynamics of Orbitofrontal, Ventrolateral, and Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So there are many parts of the prefrontal cortex, at least 7. They all do different things. They all interact to control higher order cognitive behavior as it interacts with reinforcement learning and motivational circuits and visual and auditory circuits and categorization circuits. And that's what the predictive art model brings together. So, okay, now if you want to ask me questions, I guess you had a couple of questions about advice to students. I don't know if you want to ask those. If you want other questions, whatever.
Okay, so my question concerns the idea of top-down expectations that you mentioned earlier. So to my understanding, there are top-down expectations that are learned that are compared to bottom-up inputs from the real world on a high level. So to my understanding, these top-down expectations are predictions in some way. So they predict the input that you're going to be receiving from the world, but how does the mind know which top-down expectation to activate before receiving the bottom-up input?
Well, that's a very good question. That's why I just am glad that I mentioned prefrontal cortex, because prefrontal cortex, by storing sequences of events that just occurred, you learn sequence chunks, or what I call list chunks, that are the categories that are going to predict the most likely outcomes in that environment if it's familiar to you. Okay? So you can't get that just from a single classifier, but you can get it as a prediction by a list chunk. And there are 2 kinds of predictions. One kind is bottom-up, top-down, whether it's on a feature pattern or a working memory pattern, you'll have a resonance bottom-up, top-down. The second is an associative prediction. You know, I can predict, given this sequence of events, I'm going to prime what event I expect to happen next. And then if I want, I can volitionally activate that prime and fantasize it. And so I can have internal thought and planning without having to act. Does that help? But you can't use a single category to predict the future.
So the prefrontal cortex stores these list chunks that you said, and those are integral to picking the right top-down expectation, because without them, you would have no way of setting up or priming the brain for the bottom-up input.
Well, if you're trying to predict, first, list chunks are learned. They're categories, just like an art category is learned. So you have sequences coming into working memory that are temporarily stored. And you have to know how to design a working memory. For example, let's say I've learned the following words before: my, self, and elf. 3 different words, myself and elf, and I've learned to categorize them. So when I hear those words, I can go into a whole song and dance and with associations to their meaning. Now, for the first time, I'm going to store in working memory the word myself. And I want to learn what myself means. It means something different from my, elf, and self. The question is, how do you store myself in working memory without forcing catastrophic forgetting of the learned categories for myself and elf? And that's a constraint on how working memories are designed. Okay, so first you have to know how to design working memories. Then you can have events coming in, they're stored in working memory. You have to know how to do that and what's going to happen when they are. And then they can, if you experience them till they become familiar, learn list chunks. And there you have to deal with the question, well, if myself is now familiar, there are familiar subchunks, myself and elf. There are the phonemes for the individual letters. How do you ensure that the category for the whole word myself wins in the competition? You have to know how to design it. And my work suggests a solution to that problem. So everything we say here, you can easily state what the problem is, and the solutions have very easy answers if you think about it in the right way. For example, to understand how working memories are designed, I impose what I call the long-term memory invariance principle. It forces you into very simple explanations of working memory. They explain a ton of data, and they show why all linguistic, spatial, and motor working memories have a similar circuit design. And that's why, for example, a person can easily sign as they mouth the linguistic words that they're trying to communicate, because these working memories can interact with each other seamlessly, because they have the same design. They're all lying next to each other in ventrolateral and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex.
Okay, sweet.
Advice to students, or do you want to ask something else? I'm happy to do whatever you want.
I think we have another question from the audience, then we'll get to that.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I can unmute myself. Thank you for coming, Professor Grossberg. I just want to start by asking a few clarifying questions to make sure we're on the same page. So the first, oh, and my name is Chris. So I'm computer science going to a PhD program at UChicago. So closer to you than Seattle, right? The first one is, I just want to understand, but it seems like art, right? We're focusing on art for this, but maybe also the majority of your work talks about understanding the brain and creating these theories for it. And then there's the underlying principle where if you can effectively model the brain, right, you can effectively model learning systems, right? And so then that's why you're making the comparison of art, not only as a neuroscientific theory, but also as a comparison to deep learning. Is that accurate?
I start by trying to understand hundreds of psychological experiments about many different aspects of our behavior. I'm mostly interested in things like learning, because I believe that the developmental and learning processes have a rate limiting role in our biological intelligence, so that, for example, you can learn a category that'll recognize a letter using the same dynamics as a category that'll recognize a word. So there's a great parsimony in these circuits. Now, could you repeat your question in the light of that?
I think my key question is, it's for
Deep learning, I couldn't care less about deep learning. Deep learning is a fad, and backprop got very popular. Well, first, backprop was popularized by Rummel, Hart, Hinton, and Williams in 1986. To hear them talk, you'd never realize they didn't discover it. It was discovered by Shinichi Amari, David Parker, and Paul Werbos. Paul Werbos did his Ph.D. thesis on it in the 1970s. They just popularized it, and they developed some applications. So it became popular for a while again until people realized its problems. Very, very slow learning, catastrophic forgetting, no internal representation because it's just basically a feed-forward adaptive filter, no intelligence. So it stopped being popular, it faded, and lots of other models became more popular. But then in the interim, two things happened. One is due to the World Wide Web, there were huge databases that you could Google, like millions of pictures of cats. And the speed of computers and computer networks became blindingly fast, so that now I carry a supercomputer in my pocket. But you put together rooms full of these things and you get a blistering speed of computation. Huge databases, very fast computation. So suddenly you could train a backprop network or a backprop on steroids deep learning on 100 million pictures of cats, and you put in a picture of a cat and out would come cat. And this was supposed to be some exciting thing. Well, in the field of neural networks, which I founded, that's a joke. Okay, so now you want to repeat your question?
Well, I think what I'm interested in is, you say that you couldn't care less about deep learning, right? And you say it's a fad, right? As a computer scientist, that's really, I'm sorry.
I don't care about it because it is a very weak, damaged model that teaches me nothing that I want to know. That doesn't mean,
As a neuroscientist,
no.
as a what then?
The leading technical modeler of biological intelligence. I don't think it's bad if people take a deep learning package off the shelf and it helps them through, if you have stationary data and a lot of it, and you do offline learning, you can get it to learn some predictions, and then you can put it, hardwire it into your iPhone or whatever. It can be useful. Use it. That's fine. Anything that's useful, use it. But don't delude yourself about what it is. You have to know the strengths and weaknesses of the models you use, including mine. So what I find objectionable is the sheer intellectual dishonesty of how some people describe the significance of deep learning. They never compare it with other models in comparative benchmarks. When Gail Carpenter and I introduced various art algorithms for applications, we benchmarked it against every available popular model, including backpropagation, which we blew out of the water. Now, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life benchmarking the models I develop because they're used by thousands of people who know they're provable properties. For example, in 1987, Gail Carpenter and I proved a complete set of theorems about how Art 1 learns, and they're reviewed briefly in my book, including that it doesn't experience catastrophic forgetting, that there are situations where you can learn a whole database on a single learning trial in a self-stabilizing way. So because of these things, deep learning and backprop teach me nothing. And I know Paul Werbos. I knew Frank Rosenblatt. I thought highly of Frank. I like Paul, and I think he's an authentic scientist. I don't need them to understand what I want to know. I know more than that. That's why I don't care.
So let me make sure I understand that. Then what you're saying is that for you, deep learning it has like the signal to noise ratio, right? There's a lot of dishonesty about its application, right? And you're not opposed to the methods, but can I I'm sorry, can I finish before, because I feel like there's a disconnect somewhere. So to clarify, it sounds like what you're saying is that again, you're not opposed to those methods. They just don't teach you anything, right? But if there's value in them, for example, for converting speech to text or for recognizing a cat image, you're fine with that, right?
Why shouldn't I be? I'm a technologist.
So then, okay.
The problem I have is that people who use it should understand the range of applicability. And I've heard a number of people, I don't look for them, saying, oh my God, it crashed. Now, certainly if you do it offline and you're careful, and if it crashes, you do it again and again and again until you get the criterion, and then you freeze the weights. Okay, good. One issue, though, is scalability. So catastrophic forgetting is much, much more likely if you have inputs that are dense in the vector space of inputs. And one way to avoid that is to sparsify the network, which means you have millions and millions of nodes or hundreds and hundreds of layers, which is what they've done. That's very inefficient. You don't have to do that in algorithms that self-stabilize their learning. If you look at our brain, we don't have 100, like I think I have a figure of a deep learning net with 100 layers. We don't have 100 layers in a whole brain, let alone for classification and prediction. I mean, you should give that some thought. But the reason I'm concerned is just I want people who use it to know it's untrustworthy and unreliable in a very specific scientific sense. The fact that it's not always presented with those facts in mind, I think is unfortunate to the user community. You might want to call it intellectually dishonest. For some people, that's true. For other people, it may just be they don't really know.
And I think that's a great point, because I agree with you that there's a lot of challenges with explainability, right? And with convergence. I think what I'm interested in as someone who doesn't have the background in neuroscience that you do, I want to understand what place art has in the field in your work, right? Because what I'm confused about is like you analogize a lot of your work to other great scientists, right? Which is really respectable. But what I'm confused about is what other competing theories are existing right now, and kind of where the different, like again, comparative, exactly what you're talking about, comparative analysis between these theories, and understanding where like yours may hold weight over others and vice versa, right?
Well, part of what you say has nothing to do with what I think. Okay. Did I just lose you? Don't forget, I'm a mathematician and an engineer. Okay. I got my PhD in mathematics. Don't keep focusing on neuroscience, please. I think like a mathematician and an engineer thinks. And to me, the unexplainability and catastrophic forgetting are worrisome. If I knew that about an algorithm, I would ask, is there an algorithm that doesn't have those problems? The answer is, there is at least one, and there are probably more. I'm not going to try to give a tutorial on the space of neural models. For example, support vector machines, just for starters. So, no, I'm not talking like a neuroscientist. I'm talking like a mathematician and an engineer.
Thank you. Well, I think that I'm getting word from Jana. I think it's kind of at our time, right?
I think that's correct. If you want to ask me more, I can hang out for a while. Advice to students, I could tell you. I mean, the main thing I already said, if you want to spend a lot of your life studying something, you should love it. Find a problem you really are dying to know the answer to. If you're not dying to know the answer, you're not going to put in the work. Pretty simple. Anyway, it's been a delight. So you want to ask more? Should we call it a night?
I
I
think
personally might stick around, but Chaitan, why don't you go ahead and say whether or not the group is obligated to be stuck with me?
Well, everyone could leave if they want. If people want to stay, stay. And if you want to leave, leave. I won't be insulted. You've already heard me flap my lips for an hour and a half. You know, if you got to go, I'm staying up late for you. Usually I'm asleep by 10 o'clock. So I've stayed up this late. If you want to talk some more, I'm glad. If you don't, I'll go to bed.
much. Yeah, thank you so much for talking with us. I think we're just interested in your advice for students.
What did you say? I didn't understand, Chaitan.
Thank you for staying up late. I also go to bed around 10.
Well, but
What-
for you, it's not 10, it's 7.
What is your advice for us?
The young people? Well, I just gave some.
To fall in love with the data? I would argue, shouldn't you fall in love with a problem and then go find the data?
Well, that's what I was trying to say. You know, something that you're dying to know.
Yeah,
If you're dying to know something, you haven't even defined the problem yet. You know? So, you know, you got to sort of try to figure out what are you willing to work your tail off for. And, you know, you had a question, what would I do differently if I were a kid today? And my answer is I haven't a clue. You know, I haven't been a kid for decades. But you also asked if I have specific hopes about how I want humanity to develop. And read the last few paragraphs of my book where I talk about that. In brief, I hope that, you know, so much of the success of our societies is based on being able to make things in the external world, you know, our buildings and our automobiles and our railroads. So we've spent a huge amount of effort developing technologies for the external world that have brought huge blessings to humanity. But there's much less study as students of our internal world. You know, what makes us tick, how we think, how we feel, what makes us happy and sad, you know. And the end of my book just said, I hope the book helps people to rebalance that a little bit by having, you know, a pretty thick summary of some of the things we now know about how our minds work, to give our internal worlds a little more clarity, with this, within the spirit that there's a huge amount to do. So are many of you people, what are you majors in? Engineering, math, psychology, neuroscience, what are you? You're a neuroscientist, right, Chayton?
I'm a computer science.
As well.
Didn't I say computer scientist?
Maybe you did.
I meant to, but maybe I didn't. I'm a little sleepy. Yeah, so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other comments? Yeah.
Andre's in computer science. Yegor's in computer science. Aditya is in neuroscience.
I see.
Almost, maybe will be soon. CS for Halal, CS for Alec, neuroscience for Jana, applied math for Moishi, math for Eric, intended neuroscience for Russell.
So you're pretty interdisciplinary group. Well, you know, when you're studying in neuroscience, usually, unless you're in a computational neuroscience group, you got to get in a lab, and there are two quite different things to think about getting in a lab. One is, will a particular lab teach you the hottest experimental methods available so that you could get in a lab doing what you really want to do? Another is to get in a lab with, and for that you could get in a lab with a very young person who doesn't really know much more than the technique. But then it's good to look for a more senior person who has a clearer research program where your skills might induce them to hire you to do stuff you don't know anything about. And I've trained a lot of students in our department, which is primarily a modeling department, although we also did the kind of experiments that might take days or weeks or months, but not years. So we didn't do any microelectrode neuroscience. And our students were in very great demand because they had a conceptual training that enabled them to rapidly learn large databases, and then learning the actual techniques to use in the lab was relatively easy. So you should always ask yourself, how do you sell yourself effectively? So maybe we should call it a day, or you have another question? Or
I think I'm just confused as to well, first off, thank you for talking. I'm confused, well, let me also say that I really identify with being a mathematician background. So my background is in computer science research, and specifically quantum computing, right? So lots of math there. What I'm interested in, and Chayton, I hope you find that this conversation is illuminating, right? What I'm really interested in is why you don't want to be labeled as a neuroscientist, right, Professor Grossberg? Like, because I really, sorry, what?
I didn't say that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I must have misheard you then. Do you mind kind of elaborating more?
My titles are Wang Professor of Cognitive and Neural Systems. I'm a professor of mathematics and statistics, psychological and brain science, and biomedical engineering. You kept focusing on me as a neuroscientist. I'm an interdisciplinary scientist. That's why I mentioned I'm a mathematician and an engineer, to try to point out I'm not just a neuroscientist. I'm an interdisciplinary scientist, and I bring together all these skills to do what I do. Okay.
Do Do you think that sometimes other people in the field misunderstand you, like because you come from a more theoretical, like literally math theoretical background?
Well, I don't know what people think who I never met, okay? I do know that I win prizes. Like in 2015, I won the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Society of Experimental Psychologists. That is the most distinguished group of experimental psychologists in the world. In 2017, I won the IEEE Frank Rosenblatt Computational Neuroscience Award. IEEE is the biggest engineering society in the world. In 2019, I won the Hebb Award of the International Neural Network Society, which is the biggest society of neural modelers in the world, including psychologists, neuroscientists, mathematicians, computer science engineers, for my work on learning. And in 2022, my book won the 2022 Prose Book Award in Neuroscience of the Association of American Publishers. So somebody out there likes me. And if you read the 122 reviews of my book, you'll see that among the people who like me are some of the most gifted and famous people in psychology, neuroscience, and technology. So I don't know what you mean. I don't know what you mean. Sure, there are people who don't know what I do, but you say I compare myself to Einstein, Newton. No, I didn't. I was trying to make a point about them. But even in the case of Einstein, the myth of Einstein is there are only two people in the world who understand Einstein. That was a lie. I don't know what people say about me who I haven't met. What did they say? I haven't a clue. What I say to you is the following. If someone makes a remark about what anyone's work, they say, oh, that work is crap. I always say, well, which article are you talking about? What result was crap? And then get quiet and wait for the answer. If there is no answer, you've got your answer. If they do have a genuine answer, then you've learned something, okay?
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So I think the answer is that you're pretty well recognized. Okay, so we have one more question.
Hello, Mr. Grossberg. I don't know how answerable this question is.
Take your mask off so you're not muffled.
Okay. I know, so obviously you've been around for a long time, like you've seen a lot happen in science, right? Like you've seen a lot of scientific history. I was wondering, how do you distinguish between what's really essential and what's just a fad in science?
And what is what?
And what's just a fad in science?
Well, that's hard. First, the more you know, the easier it is because you have a broader context of knowledge to evaluate things. So for example, in my life, first, in the people whose work I usually hear about, their technical ability is unquestionable. And then, of course, if they use proper statistical methodology, that's always published up front. So for me, lots of experiments of one or another kind that I read about, I would say, oh yeah, that's just that, or that's just that, or that. It's familiar, it's a variation on a theme, and some experimentalists make their whole career doing variations on one theme. And there's nothing wrong with that. you probe it a little more deeply and you elaborate it. But it's not like I said, oh, wow, what the hell does that mean? Every once in a while, there's an, oh, wow, what the hell does that mean experience for me? And then I dive in with both feet and get really excited and try to figure it out. But with a lot of my stuff, I couldn't figure it out. Even by figure it out, I mean what I currently think I know for 10, 20, 30 years. I wasn't ready. There wasn't enough data to guide my thinking. So it's not like, oh, you're such a smart person, you should understand everything right away. That's not the way it works. You got to be patient. That's why I say, find things you really are dying to know the answer, because only in that way will you put in the work, the scholarship, the thinking, all that goes into it. So at this point in my life, most things I hear about within the realm of the kinds of science I do feel somewhat familiar. But some work is radically creative. But for example, new methods like optogenetics, which has become the rage, a lot of those experiments that I read are done very well, and the technology is wonderful. But at least so far, a lot of what they've done is rediscover known facts, but in a glitzier way. Now, for quite a while, that was true of functional neuroimaging, fMRI, but it's no longer true. Functional neuroimaging has matured, and now they have some very challenging and interesting experiments with real new discoveries, especially when you do fMRI superimposed on, magnetic and ERP measures, where you have all of these happening at once. So, yeah. But the main thing is find your passion. Without passion, don't go into science. I mean, of course, if you can go into computer science because you want a good job, that, there are a lot of jobs, a lot of the problems have interesting application. You don't have to be in love, but it's nicer to have a passion. It's nicer to be in love, right? So, but if you have a good job and you find the work interesting, that's good. That's what most of us get. I'm lucky. I fell in love when I was 17. So, and I've worked like a dog to justify it. So, still do.
Well, thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that answer.
So should we say goodnight?
Sure, we'll let you go. Yeah, thank you so much.
My pleasure. And are you you recorded this, you're gonna use it for anything?
Yes, sir. I mean, we're gonna post it on YouTube. I can't say we have a big following, but yeah.
Well, if and when you post it, Chayton, please give me a heads up with the URL. And you might want to trim the beginning, because you started recording before we actually began. And but
Sure.
I'm sure you'll figure that out. Okay,
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I enjoyed it. Take care. Good luck. Be well. Bye.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.